Episode 71, May the 7th, 1915. I Went Down with the Lusitania by Viscountess Rhondda. Read by Barbara Taylor. Of all the German barbarities, the iniquitous sinking of the Lusitania by a German submarine is probably the one which will remain the most indelibly engraved on human memory. In that criminal disaster, 1,198 men, women, and children met their death by drowning. No account could conjure up for us more vividly the nightmare experience of the passengers on that ill-fated ship than does this thrilling narrative by Viscountess Rhondda, who was among the fortunate survivors. On Saturday, May the 1st, the day on which the Lusitania was to sail, in order that there might be no mistake as to German intentions, the German embassy at Washington issued a warning to passengers couched in general terms, which was printed in the New York morning papers directly under the notice of the sailing of the Lusitania. The first-class passengers, who were not due on board till about 10 o'clock, had still time after reading the warning, unmistakable in form and position, to cancel their passage if they chose. For the third-class passengers, it came too late. As a matter of fact, I believe that no British and scarcely any American passengers acted on the warning. But we were most of us very fully conscious of the risk we were running. A number of people wrote farewell letters to their home folk and posted them in New York to follow on another vessel. We were due to arrive in Liverpool on Saturday, May the 8th, and we had all imagined that the attempts would be made in the Irish Sea during our last night. We were wrong. On the Friday afternoon at about 2 o'clock, we were off the southwest coast of Ireland. The old head of Kinsale was visible in the distance. My father and I had just come out of the dining room after lunching and were strolling into the lift on D-deck. "I think we might stay up on deck tonight to see if we get our thrill," he said. I had no time to answer. There was a dull, thud-like, not very loud, but unmistakable explosion. It seemed to come from a little below us and about the middle of the vessel on the port side. That was the side towards the land. I turned and came out of the lift. Somehow the stairs seemed safer. My father walked over to look out of a porthole. I didn't wait. I had days before made up my mind that if anything happened, one's instinct would be to make straight for the boat deck. It is a horrible feeling to stay under cover, even for a few moments, in a boat that may be sinking. But that one must control that and go straight to one's cabin to fetch one's lifebelt and then onto the boat deck. As I ran up the stairs, the boat was already heeling over. As I ran, I thought, I wonder I'm not more frightened. And then, I'm beginning to get frightened, but I mustn't let myself. I collected my lifebelt, the body belt provided by the Cunard Company. On my way back, I ran into my father's cabin and took out one of his belts, fearing that he might be occupied with his papers and forget to fetch one for himself. Then I went up onto A deck, the boat deck. Here there was, of course, a choice of sides. I chose the starboard side, feeling that it would be somehow safer to be as far away from the submarine as possible. The side farther from the submarine was also the higher out of the water, as the boat had listed over towards the side on which she had been hit, and the deck was now slanting at a considerable angle. And to be as high as possible out of the water felt safer too. As I came out into the sunlight, I saw standing together the American doctor, Dr. F., and his sister-in-law, Miss C. I asked if I might stay beside them until I caught sight of my father, which I made sure of doing soon. I put on my own lifebelt and held the other in my hand. Just after I reached the deck, a stream of steerage passengers came rushing up from below and fought their way into the boat nearest to us, which was being lowered. They were white-faced and terrified. I think they were shrieking. There was no kind of order. The strongest got there first, the weak were pushed aside. Here and there, a man had his arm round a woman's waist and bore her along with him. But there were no children to be seen. No children could have lived in that throng. They rushed a boat before it was ready for them. A ship's officer made some feeble attempt to prevent them, but there was no real attempt at order or discipline. As we watched, I turned to the American girl. I always thought a shipwreck was a well-organised affair. So did I, said she, but I've learnt a devil of a lot in the last 5 minutes. 2 seamen began to lower the boat, which was full to overflowing, but no one was in command of them. One man lowered his end quickly, the other lowered his end slowly. The boat was in an almost perpendicular position when it reached the water. Half the people fell out, but the boat did not capsize, and I think most of them scrambled back afterwards. I do not know. We turned away and did not look. It was not safe to look at horrible things just then. Curious that it never for a moment struck any of us as possible to attempt to get into the boat ourselves. Even at that moment, death would have seemed better than to make part of that terror-infected crowd. I remember regretfully thinking something of this sort. That was the last boat I saw lowered. It became impossible to lower any more from our side, owing to the list on the ship. No one else except that white-faced stream seemed to lose control. A number of people were moving about the deck, gently and vaguely. They reminded one of a swarm of bees who did not know where the Queen had gone. Presently, Dr. F decided to go down and fetch lifebelts for himself and his sister-in-law. Whilst he was away, the vessel righted herself perceptibly, and word was passed round that the bulkheads had been closed and the danger was over. We laughed and shook hands, and I said, "Well, you've had your thrill all right." "I never want another," she answered. Soon after, the doctor returned bearing 2 lifebelts. He had had to wade through deep water down below to get them. Whilst we were standing, I unhooked my skirt so that it should come straight off and not impede me in the water. The list on the ship soon got worse again, and indeed became very bad. Presently, Dr. F said he thought we had better jump into the sea. We had thought of doing so before, but word had been passed round from the captain that it was better to stay where we were. Dr. F and Miss C moved towards the edge of the deck, where the boat had been, and there was no railing. I followed them, feeling frightened at the idea of jumping so far. It was, I believe, some 60 feet normally from A deck to the sea, and telling myself how ridiculous I was to have physical fear of the jump when we stood in such grave danger as we did. Others must have had the same fear, for a little crowd stood hesitating on the brink and kept me back. And then suddenly I saw that the water had come over onto the deck. We were not, as I had thought, 60 feet above the sea. We were already under the sea. I saw the water green just about up to my knees. I do not remember its coming up farther. That must have all happened in a second. The ship sank, and I was sucked right down with her. The next thing I can remember was being deep down under the water. It was very dark, nearly black. I fought to come up. I was terrified of being caught on some part of the ship and kept down. That was the worst moment of terror, the only moment of acute terror that I knew. My wrist did catch on a rope. I was scarcely aware of it at the time, but I have the mark on me to this day. At first I swallowed a lot of water. Then I remembered that I have read that one should not swallow water, so I shut my mouth. Something bothered me in my right hand and prevented me striking out with it. I discovered that it was the lifebelt I had been holding for my father. As I reached the surface, I grasped a little bit of board, quite thin, a few inches wide, and perhaps 2 or 3 feet long. I thought this was keeping me afloat. I was wrong. My most excellent lifebelt was doing that. But everything that happened after I had been submerged was a little misty and vague. I was slightly stupefied from then on. When I came to the surface, I found that I had formed part of a large, round, floating island composed of people and debris of all sorts, lying so close together that at first there was not very much water noticeable in between. People, boats, hen coops, chairs, rafts, boards, and goodness knows what besides, all floating cheek by jowl. A man with a white face and yellow moustache came and held on to the other end of my board. I did not quite like it, for I felt it was not large enough for two, but I did not feel justified in objecting. Every now and again he would try to move round towards my end of the board. This frightened me. I scarcely knew why at the time. I was probably quite right to be frightened. It is likely enough that he wanted to hold on to me. I summoned up my strength. To speak was an effort, and told him to go back to his own end so that we might keep the board properly balanced. He said nothing and just meekly went back. After a while I noticed that he had disappeared. I don't know what had happened to him. He may have gone off to a hen coop which was floating nearby. I don't know whether he had a lifebelt on or not. Somehow I think not. Many people were praying aloud in a curious, unemotional monotone. Others were shouting for help in much the same slow, impersonal chant. Boat, 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 I shouted for a minute or two, but it was obvious that there was no chance of any boat responding, so I soon desisted. One or two boats were visible, but they were a long way from where I was, and clearly had all they could do to pick up the people close beside them. So far as I could see, they did not appear to be moving much. By and by, my legs got bitterly cold, and I decided to try to swim to a boat so as to get them out of the cold water. But it was a big effort swimming. I could normally swim 100 yards or so, but I am not an expert swimmer. I swam only a few strokes and almost immediately gave up the attempt because I did not see how I could get along without letting go of my piece of board, which nothing would have induced me to abandon. There was no acute feeling of fear whilst one was floating in the water. I can remember feeling thankful that I had not been drowned underneath, but had reached the surface safely, and thinking that even if the worst happened, there could be nothing unbearable to go through now that my head was above the water. The lifebelt held me up in a comfortable sitting position, as if one were in a hammock. One was a little dazed and rather stupid and vague. I doubt whether any of the people in the water were acutely frightened or in any consciously unbearable agony of mind. When death is as close as he was, then the sharp agony of fear is not there. The thing is too overwhelming and stunning for that. One has the sense of something taking care of one. I don't mean in the sense of protecting one from death, rather of death itself being a benignant power. At moments, I wondered whether the whole thing was perhaps a nightmare from which I should wake, and once, half laughing, I think, I wondered, looking round on the sun and pale blue sky and calm sea, whether I had reached heaven without knowing it, and devoutly hoped I hadn't. One was acutely uncomfortable, no more than that, a discomfort mainly due to the intense cold. But further, at least as far as I was concerned, to the fact that, being a very bad sailor, when presently a little swell got up, I was seasick. I remember as I sat in the water, I thought out an improvement which I considered should be adopted for all lifebelts. There should be, I thought, a little bottle of chloroform strapped into each belt so that one could inhale it and lose consciousness when one wished to. I must have been exceedingly uncomfortable before I thought of that. The swell of the sea had the effect of causing the close-packed island of wreckage and people to drift apart. Presently, I was 100 yards or more away from anyone else. I looked up at the sun, which was high in the sky, and wished that I might lose consciousness. I don't know how long after that I did lose it, but that is the last thing I remember in the water. The next thing I remember is lying naked between blankets on a deck in the dark. I discovered later, on a tiny patrol steamer named the Bluebell. Every now and again, a sailor came and looked at me and said, "That's better." I had a vague idea that something had happened, but I thought that I was still on the deck of the Lusitania, and I was vaguely annoyed that some unknown sailor should be attending to me instead of my own stewardess. Gradually, memory came back. The kindly sailor offered me a cup of lukewarm tea, which I drank. We were on a teetotal vessel. There did not seem much wrong with me, except that my whole body was shaking violently, and my teeth were chattering like castanets, as I had never supposed teeth could chatter, and that I had a violent pain in the small of my back, which I suppose was rheumatism. "We left you up here to begin with," he explained, "as we thought you were dead, and it did not seem worthwhile cumbering up the cabin with you." There was some discussion as to how to get me down the cabin stairs. "It took 3 men to lift me on board," someone explained. I said that I thought I could walk, so supported on either arm and with the third man holding the back of my dripping hair, I managed to get down. I was put into the captain's bunk, where someone rather further recovered was ejected to make room for me. The warmth below was delicious. It seemed to make one almost delirious. I should say that almost all of us down there, I do not know how many rescued were on board. I can remember noticing 5 or 6, but probably there were 30 or 40, were a little drunk with the heat and the light and the joy of knowing ourselves to be alive. We were talking at the tops of our voices and laughing a great deal. At one time I was talking and laughing with some woman when a sailor came in and asked us if we had lost anyone in the wreck. I did not then know what had happened to my father. She was almost sure that her husband was drowned. He was, she had already told me. There are no veils just after a shipwreck, all she had in the world. It seemed that his loss probably meant the breaking up of her whole life, yet at that moment she was full of cheerfulness and laughter. I can remember 2 exceptions to the general merriment. The captain of the Lusitania was amongst those rescued on our little boat, but I never heard him speak. The other exception was a woman who sat silent in the outer cabin. Presently she began to speak. Quietly, gently, in a low, rather monotonous voice, she described how she had lost her child. She had, so far as I can recollect, been made to place him on a raft, which, owing to some mismanagement, had capsized. She considered that his death had been unnecessary, that it had been due to the lack of organisation and discipline on board. And gently, dispassionately, she said so to the captain of the Lusitania. She further stated her intention of saying so publicly later. It seemed to me, fresh from the incompetent muddle on the Lusitania's deck, that she entirely proved her case. A sailor who came in to attend to me suggested that she was hysterical. She appeared to me to be the one person on board who was not. We got into Queenstown harbour about 11. A man, the steward who had waited at our table on the Lusitania, came on board and told me that my father had been rescued and was already on shore. When we came alongside, the captain of the Bluebell came in and asked if I could go ashore, as he wanted to move on again. I said certainly, but not wrapped in one tiny blanket. Modesty, which had been completely absent for some hours, was beginning faintly to return. I said I could do it if only I had a couple of safety pins to fasten the thing together, but it was a man's ship, and the idea of safety pins produced hoots of laughter. Finally, someone went ashore and borrowed a British warm from one of the soldiers on the quay. Clad in this, with a blanket tucked round my waist underneath it, and wearing the captain's carpet slippers, I started for the shore. The gangway was a difficult obstacle, It was so placed that it meant stepping up 18 inches or possibly a couple of feet. I must have been pretty weak, for I had to get down onto my hands and knees and crawl onto it. At the other end of the gangway, my father was waiting.
Brother Bertie went away to do his bit the other day. With a smile on his lips and his lieutenant lips upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, "Remember me to all the birds," though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic words. Goodbye, when the day may begin from your life. Oh, it's hard to part, I know. I'll be tickled to death, I go. Don't cry, don't sigh. There's a silver lining in the sky. Once